Communion wine turned black again last night. Sister Katerina says it's my fault for doubting, but I've been following the rules perfectly for 18 months now. Well, mostly perfectly. That's the thing about rules, they don't account for human weakness, do they? I should start at the beginning. My name is Father Marcello Vaticani, and I minister to the most faithful congregation in all of Christendom. They never miss evening Massachusetts. They confess their sins with genuine anguish. They receive communion with tears in their eyes, as if their very souls depend on it. Which, God help me, they do. Archbishop Vittorio Camerlengo assigned me to San Benedetto Parish in September of 2023. Special pastoral needs, he said, adjusting his spectacles with that nervous tick I'd learned to recognize during seminary. Rural community, evening services preferred due to work schedules. You'll do fine, Marcello. Just follow the protocols. I should have asked what protocols. I should have questioned why a parish of 200 souls needed a priest with my particular background. 3 years of theological study focused on medieval mysticism, 2 years of psychiatric counseling training, and what the Vatican delicately calls unusual stress tolerance. But I was eager. Stupid and eager, the way young priests are when they think they understand God's plan. The rectory came with more books than any rural parish should need. Aquinas, naturally, Augustine, but also stranger texts, Malleus Maleficarum, treatises on spiritual warfare, Vatican documents I'd never seen in seminary. And tucked behind them, a leather journal marked, for my successor, Father Alessandro Sacristano. Father Alessandro, my predecessor. The Archbishop had mentioned him only briefly. Reassigned to Vatican City. Specialized consultation work. The journal told a different story. October 15, 2020. They asked me to stay after evening mass tonight. All of them, even little Domenico, who can't be more than 20 but speaks with the weight of centuries. Sister Katerina touched my hand, so cold, and whispered, "Father, we need to tell you about the rules." October 20th, 2020, Rule 1. Never consecrate the Eucharist during the full moon. I thought it was superstition until Monsignor Celestino's eyes began to glow during the elevation. The hunger in his face. Madonna mia, the hunger. October 23rd, 2020, Rule 2. Bless salt in every pew. Not to hurt them, never that, but to help them control themselves during the consecration. Sister Katerina explained it's like a spiritual sedative. Keeps their nature from overwhelming their faith. I'd found 17 more rules scattered through the journal's pages, written in increasingly shaky handwriting. Some made theological sense if you squinted. Others defied everything I'd learned about the nature of grace and salvation. But they worked. My first evening mass, I'd noticed the oddities. The congregation arrived precisely at sunset, as if summoned by some internal clock. They sat with unusual stillness. No shuffling, no coughing, no restless children because there were no children. Everyone over 30 at least, most much older. Sister Katerina Apostolici sat in the front pew, her wimple framing a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings. Beautiful in that ethereal way that made you think of martyred saints, until you noticed her eyes never blinked during the entire service. Behind her, Monsignor Celestino Papali, emeritus from some northern diocese, whose Latin pronunciation was flawless in ways that suggested he'd learned it when it was still a living language. Father, Sister Katerina had approached after that first mass, her voice carrying the musical quality I'd come to associate with my evening congregation. We are so grateful for your ministry. We know our needs are unusual. I'm here to serve, I'd replied, meaning it. Whatever you need. Her smile had been radiant and brief. We will teach you as we taught Father Alessandro. The rules keep us holy, Father. Without them, she'd paused, glancing toward the crucifix above the altar. Without them, we are only monsters. That was 18 months ago. Since then, I've learned to read the signs. When Monsignor Celestino's hands tremble during the Our Father, I know to shorten the homily. When Brother Domenico Clericale, barely ordained, perpetually worried, When he grips the pew until the wood creaks, I discreetly signal the altar server to add more blessed salt to the censers. When the collection basket comes back with coins that are ice cold despite the warm evening, I know someone's struggling more than usual. The confessional is the hardest part. I had Rule 5 memorized within the first month. The confessional booth must be blessed weekly with holy water mixed with wine. Their sins are heavier than human souls can bear. I learned this after the booth began to weep. Actual tears, seeping from the wood grain, after Monsignor Celestino's first confession. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. The formula remains the same, but the sins, God in heaven, the sins they confess would break the minds of ordinary priests. Brother Domenico weeps through the grate as he tells me about the dreams. Always the dreams of hunting, of warm blood, of the ecstasy of the kill that he's never, thank Christ, acted upon. I pray the rosary every night, he whispers. 50 Hail Marys, but the dreams come anyway. Monsignor Celestino confesses to memories of medieval crusades, not as history he's read, but as battles he fought. In 1189, in 1204, names and dates that match historical records with impossible precision. I remember the siege of Acre, he'll say, his voice carrying 8 centuries of weariness. The things we did in God's name, the things I did before I found, before I was changed. Sister Caterina's confessions are poetry written in human suffering. She speaks of watching empires fall, of tending plague victims in 1347 when she was already 300 years old, of the moment she realized that faith, genuine, desperate faith, could sustain her without the need for human blood. I fed on despair for so long, she told me once. Now I feed on hope. Your hope, Father. The hope you give us every evening when you consecrate the host despite knowing what we are. And I do know what they are. God help me, I've known from the beginning. They are vampires. All of them. My entire congregation consists of the undead who have somehow found a way to remain. Not human, perhaps, but humane. Holy even. Their faith isn't metaphorical. It's literal sustenance. The Eucharist doesn't symbolize Christ's blood for them. It replaces their need for human blood. The Blessed Sacrament is their daily bread in the most visceral way possible. The rules keep them stable, keep them good, keep them from becoming the monsters that their nature demands. But the wine turned black last night during consecration, and that means someone is falling. Rule 7. I learned this one from Father Alessandro's final entry, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. If the communion wine turns black during consecration, evacuate immediately. One of them is losing their humanity. I didn't evacuate. How could I? These people, these beings, they trust me. Sister Caterina's eyes filled with tears when she saw the wine darken. Monsignor Celestino actually crossed himself, a gesture that should have been impossible if the folklore is true. Brother Domenico began reciting the Jesus prayer in a voice thick with panic. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Instead of evacuating, I finished the Massachusetts. I distributed communion from the chalice that held wine the color of venous blood, and I watched my congregation receive it with the desperate gratitude of the truly hungry. Because that's what they are, hungry, always hungry, and only faith made manifest in bread and wine keeps them from feeding on the living. The question isn't why the wine turned black. The question is which one of them is slipping, and whether my faith is strong enough to pull them back from the edge. Tonight is the full moon, which means no evening mass, per Rule 1. Cardinal Serafino Pontifici arrives tomorrow from Vatican City for his quarterly inspection, and I still need to explain why my monthly reports keep mentioning irregularities in communion wine consistency and unusual pastoral counseling needs. And somewhere in my congregation of monsters and saints, someone is losing the battle between their nature and their soul. Deacon Paolo Sacerdote will handle morning prayers tomorrow. He's a good man, devoted, but he doesn't know. Can't know. The Archbishop was very clear about operational security when he assigned me here. Some ministries require discretion, Marcello. The faithful don't always understand the breadth of God's mercy. I need to check Father Alessandro's journal again. There might be something I missed, some rule I haven't followed correctly. His handwriting deteriorated so badly in the final entries that I might have misread something crucial. Because if I lose even one of them to their darker nature, I'll have failed not just as a priest, but as a guardian of something precious and impossible, the redemption of the damned. The evening bells are ringing. Time for Vespers. They'll be arriving soon, my faithful flock of creatures who should not exist but do, who should not be capable of grace but are. God forgive me, I love them, every monstrous, holy one of them, and I'm terrified that love won't be enough to keep them human. Cardinal Serafino Pontifici arrived at San Benedetto Parish 3 hours before sunset, which should have been my first warning. Cardinals don't travel during daylight hours to inspect parishes that hold only evening services. Not unless they already know why. He emerged from the black sedan with the fluid grace of someone half his apparent age, though his hair was silver and his face carried lines that suggested decades of Vatican politics. The scarlet zucchetto caught the late afternoon light as he surveyed the humble stone church with eyes that seemed older than his features. "Your Eminence," I bowed, kissing his ring as protocol demanded. The skin was cold, not merely cool from the October air, but cold the way marble is cold, as if warmth had never touched it. "Father Vaticani." His voice carried the musical quality I'd learned to recognize in my evening congregation, though his was tempered by authority. "We need to discuss your reports." My stomach dropped. The monthly reports I'd been filing with Archbishop Camerlengo were carefully sanitized. Communion wine anomalies blamed on storage issues, confession scheduling irregularities attributed to work schedules, the unusually high consumption of blessed salt explained as enhanced devotional practices. I thought I was being clever. "Of course, Your Eminence. Perhaps we could speak in the rectory." "No." His gaze fixed on the church doors. "I wish to see the confessional first. There have been concerns about structural integrity." The confessional, where I'd been blessing the booth weekly with holy water mixed with wine because their sins were too heavy for ordinary wood to bear, where the grain had wept actual tears, where I'd learned to keep extra handkerchiefs because grown men, grown vampires, sobbed like children when describing centuries of accumulated guilt. Inside the church, Cardinal Serafino moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked these aisles before. He paused at each pew, running his fingers along the wood where I'd embedded blessed salt according to Rule 2. He nodded approvingly, the way a teacher might acknowledge a student's correct answer. "Tell me about Brother Domenico," he said without preamble, settling into the front pew where Sister Caterina usually sat. "Your Eminence, the young one, recently ordained, perpetual state of spiritual distress. Your reports mention his need for frequent confession." I chose my words carefully. "Brother Domenico struggles with intrusive thoughts, dreams that disturb his prayer life. It's not uncommon among new priests." "Father," the cardinal's voice carried a note of gentle rebuke, "I have been overseeing parishes like this one for longer than you might imagine. Brother Domenico Clericale was turned in 1847. He has been recently ordained for 176 years. The world tilted. You know. I know that this parish serves a very specific congregation. I know that you have been doing exemplary work under challenging circumstances. And I know that someone has been struggling with their spiritual discipline, because the wine doesn't turn black without cause." Cardinal Serafino rose and walked to the confessional booth. He placed his palm flat against the wood, and I watched his expression shift from official interest to genuine concern. "The wood is saturated," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "How often have you been blessing it?" "Weekly, as instructed in Father Alessandro's journal. Holy water mixed with wine, as per Rule 5. "Show me the journal." In the rectory, I produced Father Alessandro's leather-bound record. Cardinal Serafino read with the speed of someone already familiar with the contents, occasionally pausing to make soft sounds of disapproval. "Here," He pointed to an entry from early 2021. Alessandro mentions that Brother Domenico confessed to feeding dreams of hunting and killing. But look at this entry from last month. Father. What does it say? I squinted at Father Alessandro's deteriorating handwriting. October 2021. Brother Domenico reports, the dreams have stopped. No longer dreams of hunting. Now dreams of teaching children. And what did you make of this progression? I assumed he was getting better, that the prayers were working. Cardinal Serafino closed the journal with more force than necessary. Father Vaticani, when a vampire stops dreaming of blood and starts dreaming of children, it is not spiritual progress. It is the beginning of a different kind of hunger. The implications hit me like cold water. You're saying he's... What? I'm saying that Brother Domenico has discovered that young souls taste different than mature ones. Sweeter, more innocent. The cardinal's voice carried centuries of weariness. The church has dealt with this progression before. It's why we have Rule 8. Rule 8? There's no Rule 8 in Father Alessandro's journal, because Father Alessandro never encountered this situation. Rule 8. If any congregation member begins confessing dreams of children, educational fantasies, or paternal urges toward the young, immediate intervention is required. They must be relocated to a monastery setting where they cannot interact with minors. My mouth went dry. But Brother Domenico doesn't interact with children. There are no children in our evening congregation. Father, where does Brother Domenico spend his mornings? I thought about it. I'd never actually asked. I knew he attended my evening services, received communion with tears in his eyes, confessed his spiritual struggles with genuine anguish. But his daylight hours, he volunteers, I said slowly, the realization dawning with horrible clarity. He volunteers at the diocesan elementary school, teaching catechism to the 7-year-olds. Cardinal Serafino nodded grimly. And how long has he been doing this volunteer work? I thought back through the months, correlating Brother Domenico's increasingly peaceful demeanor during evening services with, since last spring, around Easter, 6 months, precisely when your reports began mentioning communion wine irregularities. The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified me. Brother Domenico hadn't been getting better through prayer and spiritual discipline. He'd been getting worse, but in a way that looked like improvement from the outside. His desperate hunger hadn't disappeared. It had simply found a new, more specific target. Your Eminence, he would never actually harm a child. His faith is genuine. The way he receives communion, the anguish in his confessions. Father, may I tell you about another priest I knew? Father Giuliano served a similar parish in Tuscany during the Renaissance. Magnificent faith, brought tears to my eyes during Massachusetts, confessed his struggles with such genuine remorse that I truly believed we had achieved something miraculous. A vampire sustained entirely by grace rather than blood. Cardinal Serafino moved to the window, gazing out at the lengthening shadows. Father Giuliano also began having dreams about children, also found volunteer work that gave him access to the innocent, also maintained his outward devotion while slowly, carefully selecting his prey. By the time we realized what was happening, he had been feeding on the spiritual essence of children for months. Not their blood, their souls, their capacity for wonder, for trust, for unquestioning faith. I struggled to find words. That's impossible. The Eucharist sustains them. Their communion is genuine. The Eucharist sustains their bodies, Father. But their souls are still vampiric. And a vampiric soul can hunger for more than blood. It can hunger for innocence itself. The cardinal turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw something almost human in his ancient eyes. Brother Domenico has been feeding on the children's capacity for faith, not harming them physically, not drinking their blood, simply diminishing their spiritual potential. The parents think their children are going through a phase, less interest in prayers, fewer questions about God, decreased wonder at the mysteries of faith. They assume it's natural maturation, but it's not. It's spiritual vampirism, and it's why your communion wine has been turning black. The host can sustain a body that feeds on blood, Father. It cannot sustain a soul that feeds on stolen innocence. I sank into my desk chair, the weight of 18 months of pastoral care collapsing around me. What do I do? First, Brother Domenico must be removed from all contact with children. Immediately. I will arrange for his transfer to the monastery of San Giuseppe in the Tuscan hills. They specialize in cases like his. And second, Cardinal Serafino's expression grew troubled. Second, you must understand that this situation indicates a fundamental problem with your pastoral approach. The rules, as Father Alessandro understood them, were designed for vampires who feed on blood but seek redemption through faith. They are insufficient for vampires who have discovered alternative forms of sustenance. He pulled a red leather portfolio from his briefcase, far thicker than Father Alessandro's journal. These are the complete protocols for what the Vatican calls special ministry parishes. Father Alessandro was given only the basic survival rules because his congregation was stable. Yours is not. I opened the portfolio with trembling hands. The pages were filled with rules, amendments, case studies, theological interpretations I'd never seen. Rule 8 was there, along with Rules 9 through 26. Rules about vampires who fed on different aspects of human experience. Not just blood, but fear, faith, hope, despair, innocence, wisdom, creativity. How many parishes like this are there? I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. Globally, 47 active parishes, 12 monitoring stations, and 3 specialized monasteries. The Church has been managing supernatural congregations for longer than most people realize. Cardinal Serafino's voice carried the weight of institutional memory. We are not merely shepherds to the living, Father. We are shepherds to all souls that seek redemption, regardless of their biological status. A knock at the rectory door interrupted us. Sunset. My congregation would be arriving soon for evening vespers, including Brother Domenico, who had no idea that his carefully maintained spiritual routine was about to be shattered. Your Eminence, may I ask? Are you? Am I one of them? The Cardinal smiled, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of elongated canines. I have been ministering to supernatural congregations since 1689, Father. My particular hunger is for knowledge, specifically theological knowledge. The Church feeds my need for understanding divine mysteries, and in return, I help manage parishes that require specialized oversight. So the Vatican has known about supernatural beings for millennia, Father. We have been quietly providing pastoral care to those who seek redemption for nearly as long. It is one of our more discretionary ministries. Another knock, more insistent. Through the rectory window, I could see my congregation gathering in the church courtyard. Sister Caterina stood with her usual serene composure, but Monsignor Celestino was pacing with barely controlled agitation. And there was Brother Domenico, looking younger and more innocent than ever, chatting cheerfully with some of the older parishioners about his volunteer work with the children. What do I tell them? I asked. You tell them that Brother Domenico has been called to serve in a different capacity. You do not tell them why. And tomorrow, you begin implementing the complete rule system to prevent this situation from recurring with other congregation members. And if they ask questions? Cardinal Serafino's expression grew stern. Father, you are their priest, not their friend. They are supernatural beings who have chosen to seek redemption through faith, but they are still supernatural beings. Your pastoral care must be informed by wisdom, not merely compassion. The evening bells began to ring, calling my monstrous, holy congregation to prayer. In a few hours, I would have to watch Brother Domenico receive what might be his final communion from my hands. Knowing that his spiritual hunger had found a target I was powerless to protect. The wine might not turn black tonight, Cardinal Serafino's presence would likely provide enough spiritual authority to stabilize the congregation temporarily. But tomorrow, when I was alone again with my vampires and their impossible needs, I would have to learn an entirely new way of shepherding souls that existed in the space between damnation and grace. God help me, I wasn't sure I was strong enough for the complete truth of what I'd volunteered to become. But the bells were ringing and my flock was gathering, and whatever else they were still souls in need of pastoral care. Even the monsters, especially the monsters. The full moon rose like a wound in December's throat, casting silver light through San Benedetto's stained glass windows. Christmas Eve and Archbishop Camerlengo's directive burned in my pocket like a coal. Midnight Mass will proceed as scheduled. Accommodate no special requests from parishioners regarding timing. Accommodate no special requests. Rule 3 screamed in my memory. End every service before 3 a.m. Their holy restraint weakens as dawn approaches. But Christmas Midnight Mass traditionally began at 11 p.m. and ran until nearly 2 a.m. with all the readings, carols, and extended communion. I tried calling the Archbishop 3 times, received only his secretary's assurance that His Excellency's instructions are final. Cardinal Serafino stood beside me in the sacristy, adjusting his liturgical vestments with movements too fluid for his apparent age. Brother Domenico's transfer to the monastery had left my congregation restless. 3 weeks of questions I couldn't answer, communion wine that flickered between red and black like a warning. "You're perspiring, Father." The cardinal's voice held clinical observation rather than concern. I wiped my forehead with shaking hands. "The timing is wrong. Rule 3 exists for a reason. You know what happens when we push past their limits. I know that the Church Universal celebrates the Nativity at midnight on Christmas Eve, and that your parish is not exempt from this tradition." His tone carried finality that made my stomach clench. "Your congregation will adapt." Through the sacristy window, I watched my vampires gather in the courtyard with unusual behavior. Sister Caterina clutched her rosary so tightly I could see her knuckles white from 50 feet away. Monsignor Celestino paced in tight circles, muttering what looked like prayers but moved too fast for human speech. Madre Francesca stood statue still, but her head turned to track movement with predatory precision. And they were all here, every single member of my congregation, when normally a few would skip services during the full moon. The complete rule portfolio from Cardinal Serafino had taught me that vampires experience compulsive religious need during lunar peaks. Their spiritual hunger becomes desperate, overwhelming their usual restraint. "Your Eminence, they're already showing signs of instability. Look at Monsignor Celestino, he's been circling for 10 minutes. That's not devotional preparation. That's barely controlled hunting behavior." Then we begin early. Cardinal Serafino lifted the chalice, checking the wine's color in the lamplight. "Deep red, stable for now. Perhaps your congregation will surprise you with their spiritual discipline." The bells began their call to midnight mass, and my vampires filed into the church with unsettling silence. Usually there was soft conversation, gentle murmurs of Christmas greetings. Tonight they moved like water, finding their pews with minimal sound and maximum awareness of each other's positions. I processed down the aisle carrying the lectionary, Cardinal Serafino behind me with ceremonial dignity. The church felt different, charged with tension that made my skin crawl. Every candle flame seemed brighter, every shadow deeper. The blessed salt I'd embedded in each pew should have provided comfort, but tonight it felt like the only thing standing between order and chaos. "Dominus vobiscum," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the stone space. "Et cum spiritu tuo." My congregation responded in perfect Latin unison, but their voices harmonized in ways human voices shouldn't, creating undertones that made my bones resonate. The first reading proceeded normally. Cardinal Serafino delivered the gospel with Vatican-trained precision, and my vampires listened with their usual intense attention. But I could see the strain beginning. Hands gripping pew backs, heads bowed not in prayer but in concentration, the careful stillness of predators fighting their nature. 11:47 p.m. still within normal bounds. The homily was mercifully brief. Cardinal Serafino spoke about redemption through divine grace, his words carrying weight that seemed to physically settle over the congregation. Sister Caterina's shoulders relaxed slightly. Madre Francesca's predatory alertness dimmed to mere caution. But then came the Eucharistic prayer, and everything began to fracture. "Take this, all of you, and drink from it," I intoned, raising the chalice. "For this is the chalice of my blood." The wine flickered. Just for a moment, the deep red wavered toward something darker. I steadied my hands, continued the consecration, and watched the liquid return to its proper color. Cardinal Serafino nodded approvingly from his position beside the altar. 12:23 a.m. Past midnight, but still manageable. Communion began with Sister Caterina, as always. She approached the altar rail with reverent composure, received the host with tears in her eyes as she always did. "Corpus Christi," I murmured, placing the consecrated bread on her tongue. "Amen," she whispered, but her voice cracked slightly. Monsignor Celestino followed, then Madre Francesca, then the others. Each reception of communion proceeded properly, but I could see the effort it required. Hands trembling with restraint, eyes fixed on the floor to avoid meeting my gaze directly. The careful breathing of beings fighting their fundamental nature. 12:41 a.m. Getting close to the danger zone. That's when Dr. Elena Conciliere entered the church. I'd never seen her at evening services. She was one of the few fully human parishioners who knew about our unusual schedule but attended morning mass instead. Now she walked down the center aisle carrying her medical bag, heading directly for the communion rail with civilian authority. "Doctor," Cardinal Serafino interrupted, his voice carrying concern. "The service is already in progress. Mrs. Bertinelli collapsed at home," she announced, loud enough for the entire congregation to hear. "Heart attack. She's asking for last rites, but she has maybe 20 minutes. I need Father Vaticani immediately." Mrs. Bertinelli, 73 years old, lived alone on the outskirts of town, attended morning mass faithfully for 40 years. A deathbed visit was an absolute pastoral obligation, something I couldn't refuse without abandoning my ordination vows. But leaving now would mean abandoning my vampire congregation at their moment of greatest spiritual need, during the full moon, past midnight, with their restraint already fraying. "Dr. Conciliere," I began carefully, "perhaps after the service concludes." "She doesn't have that long, Father." The doctor's voice carried medical certainty. "If you're coming, it has to be now." 12:44 a.m. 16 minutes from Rule 3's absolute limit. I looked at my congregation. 23 vampires in various states of spiritual desperation, fighting their nature through pure faith and increasingly fragile discipline. Sister Caterina had begun praying the rosary at superhuman speed, her lips moving in barely visible Latin. Monsignor Celestino gripped his pew so tightly the wood was creaking. Madre Francesca stared at the crucifix with the fixed intensity of someone using visual focus to block out other sensations. Then I looked at Cardinal Serafino, whose expression suggested this was somehow a test. "Your Eminence, I cannot abandon my congregation at this moment." "Father," his voice cut through my protest with Vatican authority, "your first obligation is to the dying." "Dr. Conciliere, how far?" 10 minutes by car, maybe 15 to perform the rites, which would bring us to 1:15 a.m. Still within Rule 3's boundaries, but barely. And assuming Mrs. Bertinelli died quickly, assuming no complications, assuming I could perform last rites with minimal ceremony. "Go," Cardinal Serafino commanded. I will conclude the Massachusetts. Every instinct I developed over 18 months screamed against leaving. My vampires were my responsibility, my pastoral charge. They needed their priest during their moment of greatest vulnerability, not a Vatican cardinal who saw them as theological curiosities to be managed. But Mrs. Bertinelli was dying, and she was human, and her soul mattered too. "I'll be back within the hour," I told my congregation, hating how uncertain my voice sounded. Cardinal Serafino will conclude the service. Sister Caterina looked up from her rosary with something that might have been fear. Father, please, trust in the Cardinal's authority, I interrupted, though the words felt like abandonment. Continue your prayers. 12:47 a.m. Dr. Conciliere drove like she was racing death, which she was. I spent the 10-minute drive trying to prepare mentally for rapid last rites, calculating how quickly I could return to San Benedetto. Mrs. Bertinelli's cottage appeared in the headlights. Dark windows, too quiet. Around back, Dr. Conciliere directed. I left through her kitchen when I came to find you. We hurried through the small garden, and I could hear labored breathing before we reached the door. Mrs. Bertinelli lay on her kitchen floor, conscious but gray-faced, her eyes wide with the particular fear of someone who knows they're dying. Father, she whispered, reaching toward me with trembling hands. I'm frightened. I knelt beside her, beginning the ritual with practiced efficiency. Do not be afraid. God is with you. Do you wish to confess your sins? The confession took 3 minutes. Minor transgressions, the usual guilt of age and solitude. I granted absolution, anointed her forehead with holy oil, began the prayers for the dying. Dr. Conciliere monitored vital signs with professional detachment. 1:04 a.m. Mrs. Bertinelli's breathing grew shallower. I held her hand, reciting the ancient prayers that shepherded souls from this world to the next. Go forth, Christian soul, from this world in the name of God, the Almighty Father who created you. Her grip tightened suddenly. Father, what about the others? What others, Mrs. Bertinelli? The ones at the church. I saw them through my window sometimes, gathering after dark. Are they? Her voice became urgent despite her failing strength. Are they safe with that cardinal? 1:07 a.m. Ice formed in my stomach. What do you mean? I saw him before, Father. Decades ago. Same face, same voice. He hasn't aged. Her eyes found mine with startling clarity. What is he? Before I could answer, her hand went limp. Dr. Conciliere checked for pulse, found none, marked time of death with clinical precision. 1:09 a.m. 21 minutes until Rule 3's absolute limit, and Mrs. Bertinelli's dying words had revealed something impossible. Cardinal Serafino, unchanged over decades, a vampire himself, left alone with my congregation during their moment of greatest vulnerability. Doctor, I have to get back to the church immediately. The death certificate can wait. Now, the drive back to San Benedetto took forever and no time at all. The church windows glowed with candlelight, but something was wrong with the quality of illumination. Too bright, too steady, like flames that never flickered. Dr. Conciliere parked in the courtyard, and I could hear singing from inside the church. Latin hymns, but not Christmas carols. Something older, deeper, with harmonies that made my teeth ache. 1:17 a.m. I pushed through the church doors and stopped dead. My congregation knelt in perfect rows, but they were no longer praying to the crucifix. They faced the altar where Cardinal Serafino stood with arms raised, speaking Latin that predated the modern liturgy by centuries. The chalice in his hands wasn't the one we'd used for communion. This was golden, ornate, filled with liquid so dark it seemed to absorb light, and my vampires were responding to his words with voices that harmonized in frequencies no human throat could produce, their eyes reflecting candlelight like animals. Your Eminence, I called out, my voice cracking with something between authority and desperation. He turned toward me with a smile that revealed elongated canines, his face unchanged but somehow more itself. Ancient authority no longer hidden behind Vatican diplomacy. Father Vaticani, how convenient. Mrs. Bertinelli's death provided perfect timing. There was no heart attack, of course not. Dr. Conciliere has been working with the diocese for years, helping manage situations that require clerical absence during delicate moments. The pieces assembled themselves with horrible clarity. The perfectly timed emergency call, the dying woman who somehow recognized Cardinal Serafino from decades past, the convenient excuse to abandon my congregation during their most vulnerable hour. You planned this. I planned to see what your vampires would choose when given the option of deeper spiritual nourishment. He gestured to the dark chalice. They could have waited for your return, maintained their careful discipline, continued their half-starved existence sustained by ordinary communion. Instead, they chose to drink from the true cup. Sister Katerina rose from her kneeling position with fluid grace, her face peaceful for the first time in months. Father, we're not hungry anymore. We're complete. What is in that chalice? I demanded. Concentrated essence of faith, Cardinal Serafino replied with academic precision. Distilled from willing donors across decades, blessed with rituals that predate Christ's crucifixion. Your congregation has graduated from basic spiritual sustenance to true vampiric communion with the divine. The rules were designed to keep them weak, Father. Manageable, dependent on your daily ministry rather than achieving genuine spiritual autonomy. His eyes glittered with something that might have been pride. Tonight, they have tasted what they could become if they stopped fighting their nature and started embracing their potential for transcendence. 1:24 a.m. Monsignor Celestino, I called out, hoping to reach at least one of them. Remember your confessions. Remember why you sought redemption. The elderly vampire turned toward me with expression that was both familiar and transformed. Father, I confessed because I believed redemption required suffering. Tonight, I learned that redemption can mean apotheosis. And the children Brother Domenico was feeding on? Was that apotheosis too? Cardinal Serafino's expression grew stern. Brother Domenico lost his way because he was spiritually malnourished. These vampires, he gestured to my congregation, will never need to steal innocence from children because they have access to pure faith directly. Faith stolen from other sources. Faith freely given by those who understand the cosmic importance of supernatural spiritual evolution. My congregation began to stand, moving with synchronized precision that suggested hive-mind coordination. They weren't my individual parishioners anymore. They were something collective, unified by whatever they'd consumed from that golden chalice. Your Eminence, I cannot allow this corruption of my pastoral responsibility. Father Marcello, Sister Katerina's voice carried hypnotic harmony. You're still thinking in terms of human spiritual needs. We've evolved beyond those limitations. We can offer you the same transcendence. The chalice appeared in my peripheral vision, held by hands I didn't see move. The liquid inside seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and I could smell something that was both wine and something indefinitely more complex. Faith distilled into physical substance. Just one sip. Cardinal Serafino's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Experience what your congregation has discovered. Understand why the rules were chains rather than protection. 1:29 a.m. 1 minute from Rule 3's absolute limit, but Rule 3 no longer seemed relevant. My congregation had moved beyond the need for human-imposed boundaries. They stood around me in a perfect circle, their faces serene with supernatural peace, offering transformation that would end my isolation as their merely human shepherd. The chalice pressed against my lips, and I could taste something that was bigger than wine, deeper than blood, more fundamental than flesh. All I had to do was swallow, and I would understand everything. Why the Vatican managed supernatural parishes, why some priests were called to shepherd monsters, why redemption sometimes required embracing rather than fighting the darkness within. All I had to do was drink, and I would never be alone again. The liquid touched my tongue, and it tasted like every prayer I'd ever prayed, every moment of genuine faith I'd ever experienced, every instance of transcendent connection with the divine, concentrated into physical form and offered as communion with beings who had found a different path to God. I was drowning in borrowed faith, surrounded by my transformed congregation, held in the embrace of Cardinal Serafino's ancient authority, when the church bells began to ring 3 a.m. And somewhere in the sound of those bells, I heard the echo of Rule 3 and remembered that some boundaries exist not to limit transcendence, but to preserve the choice to remain human. I bit down on my own tongue, hard enough to draw blood, hard enough to ground myself in physical pain that couldn't be transcended or transformed or evolved beyond. The taste of my own blood cut through the borrowed faith like acid through silk. "No," I whispered, then louder, "No." And in that refusal, something in the church shifted, like a spell breaking or a dream ending. My congregation blinked in unison, their perfect synchronization fracturing into individual confusion. Cardinal Serafino's expression of transcendent authority cracked into something more human, more frustrated. The golden chalice disappeared. I never saw where it went, only that it was no longer there. "Father!" Sister Katerina's voice carried her familiar uncertainty, the spiritual fragility I'd been trying to heal for 18 months. "I'm here," I told her, and meant it in ways I hadn't understood before. 3:01 a.m. Rule 3's absolute limit, passed but somehow not broken, because sometimes the rules bend to accommodate love rather than control. "Your Eminence," I addressed Cardinal Serafino directly, "I think you should leave my parish now." He studied me with expression that mingled disappointment with something that might have been respect. "The offer remains open, Father. When you grow tired of shepherding half-starved souls, the Vatican has other positions available." "I'll keep that in mind." He gathered his ceremonial vestments with dignified efficiency, then paused at the church doors. "Father Marcello, may I offer one piece of counsel?" "Of course. Your congregation chose to drink from my chalice tonight, despite months of your pastoral care. Ask yourself why they were so hungry for something you weren't providing." After he left, I stood alone with my vampires in the aftermath of transcendence refused. They looked at me with expressions that mingled gratitude with something that might have been disappointment, and I realized that Cardinal Serafino's final words contained a truth I wasn't ready to examine. They had been hungry. Despite my careful rule-following, despite my genuine pastoral care, despite 18 months of trying to shepherd their souls toward redemption, they had been spiritually starving, and I still didn't know how to feed them what they actually needed. Christmas morning would arrive in a few hours, and my monstrous, holy congregation would return to their daylight hiding places, and I would return to my rectory to write another carefully sanitized report for Archbishop Camerlengo. But everything had changed, even if nothing had changed, and I suspected that the real test of my calling as their shepherd was just beginning. God help me, I wasn't sure I was strong enough for what came next. But the bells had stopped ringing, and my flock was still gathered, and whatever else they were still souls in need of pastoral care. Even the monsters, especially when the monsters were also saints, and I was still learning the difference. 3 months after Christmas Eve, and I still can't consecrate wine without checking the color twice. The morning reports to Archbishop Camerlengo have become exercises in creative theology. Parish morale remains high following the Cardinal's Christmas visit. Congregation members demonstrate increased spiritual dedication and community cohesion. All true. I just don't mention that their spiritual dedication involves feeding on concentrated faith, or that their community cohesion stems from shared memories of transcendence I help them refuse. My hands shake less now during Mass, but they still shake. Dr. Conciliere transferred to a hospital in Naples 2 weeks after Christmas. Career advancement opportunity, she told me with a straight face, though we both knew she was fleeing whatever Vatican network had recruited her for supernatural parish management. Her replacement, Dr. Bianchi, attends morning Mass and asks no questions about why my evening congregation requires unusual medical discretion. Some improvements, I suppose. The real changes began in January, when Sister Katerina approached me after Epiphany Mass with a request that made my carefully reconstructed worldview crack again. "Father, we need to talk about the children." We were alone in the sacristy, the rest of the congregation having dispersed to their daylight sanctuaries. Sister Katerina looked exactly as she had 18 months ago when I first arrived. Gray hair pinned beneath her veil, rosary worn smooth from decades of prayer, hands that trembled slightly from whatever transformation had made her what she was. But her eyes held something new, an awareness that hadn't been there before Cardinal Serafino's chalice. "What children, sister?" "The ones like us, the transformed ones." She folded her hands with careful precision. There are vampire children in the city, Father, abandoned by whoever made them, too young to understand their hunger, feeding on whoever they can catch. My stomach dropped. How do you know this? Since Christmas Eve, we sense them. The chalice awakened something in us, even though we didn't complete the transformation. We can feel others of our kind within several kilometers. She paused, studying my expression. There are at least 7 children, Father, all under the age of 12, all hungry. Brother Domenico's face flashed through my memory. His breakdown over feeding on children, his desperate confession, his eventual transfer to the monastery. Sister, the Church's position on vampiric feeding. The Church's position assumes we have a choice. Her voice carried quiet determination. These children don't understand theology, Father. They understand hunger. And right now, they're satisfying that hunger by taking what they need from schoolyards and playgrounds. The implications hit me like physical blows. Children preying on children, creating cycles of trauma and transformation that would ripple outward indefinitely. Unless someone intervened with supernatural authority they might actually respect. What are you suggesting? That we expand the parish, that we bring them into our congregation, teach them the rules, help them find ways to satisfy their spiritual hunger without destroying innocence. She met my gaze directly. That you become shepherd to the truly lost sheep, not just the ones old enough to have learned self-control. The Vatican would never approve. The Vatican doesn't need to know. Sister Caterina's interruption carried the same steel I'd heard from Cardinal Serafino, but softer, more maternal. You write reports about adult congregation members. Children can be uncounted blessings. That conversation led to others. Hushed discussions after evening services about expanding our spiritual community. Monsignor Celestino sharing his memories of Vatican safe houses for supernatural beings during the medieval period. Madre Francesca offering the abandoned convent outside town as a sanctuary space. My congregation was planning to become a resistance network, and they wanted me to lead it. You understand what you're asking? I'd said during one particularly intense planning session. We'd be violating every protocol the Vatican has established for supernatural parish management. If they discover what we're doing, they'll transfer you to another parish with different supernatural challenges. Monsignor Celestino had replied with dry humor. The Church doesn't waste priests with our specialized experience, Father. They need us more than we need them. The first vampire child we rescued was named Pietro, 8 years old. Transformed sometime around his 6th birthday, living in the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city. Sister Caterina and I found him feeding on the emotional residue around a homeless encampment, too young to understand why he was always hungry, too traumatized to trust adults. Getting him to San Benedetto required 3 nights of patient approach, offering him blessed bread that eased his hunger without requiring him to harm anyone. When he finally agreed to come with us, he held my hand with grip that could have crushed bones, looking around the church with wonder I hadn't seen in a child's face for months. Is this God's house, Father? Yes, Pietro. And you're welcome here. Even though I'm a monster, I knelt to meet his eyes. This child who'd been transformed into something that shouldn't exist, abandoned by whoever had made him, surviving through methods that would horrify any normal adult. Especially because you think you're a monster. That's what church is for. 3 months later, and we have 11 vampire children in our expanded congregation. They attend special evening services I've developed specifically for their needs, shorter attention spans, different spiritual hungers, questions about God that come from experiencing the world through supernatural senses. The rules have evolved too. Rule 8. Vampire children require communion twice weekly, not once. Their spiritual hunger develops faster than their self-control. Rule 9. Never leave holy water where the children can reach it. They will drink it compulsively and make themselves sick. Rule 10. If a child asks whether God still loves them after transformation, the answer is always yes, immediately without theological qualification. Rule 11. Children under 10 cannot participate in confession. Their concept of sin is too underdeveloped, and the spiritual weight damages them. Rule 12. Always have blessed bread available during children's services. Emotional regulation requires constant spiritual nourishment at their developmental level. The most challenging part isn't the expanded rules or the additional liturgical complications. It's watching Pietro and the others try to understand their place in God's creation when every theological framework I learned in seminary assumes that vampires are either damned or at best spiritually neutral. How do you explain theodicy to an 8-year-old vampire who wants to know why God let someone transform him? How do you discuss salvation with children who experience divine grace differently than human souls? I've started developing what I privately call supernatural pediatric theology, though I doubt the Vatican would approve of that terminology. The real test came 6 weeks ago, when Archbishop Camerlengo announced a surprise pastoral visit. Father Vaticani, I've received remarkable reports about your parish's spiritual vitality. The diocese would like to document your methods for potential implementation in other challenging assignments. Challenging assignments. Vatican euphemism for supernatural parishes. I had 48 hours to prepare San Benedetto for inspection by a human archbishop who couldn't know we were harboring 11 vampire children in addition to our original 23 adult congregation members. The solution came from Madre Francesca. The convent has a full basement chapel, Father. We'll conduct a youth retreat during the Archbishop's visit. So Archbishop Camerlengo toured a perfectly normal evening parish, meeting adult vampire congregants who had learned to present themselves as merely eccentric. Devoted Catholics with unusual schedules and dietary restrictions. Nothing more supernatural than extreme piety. He seemed impressed. Your congregation displays remarkable dedication, Father. I haven't seen such consistent attendance and spiritual engagement in decades. They have very specific spiritual needs, Your Excellence. I try to accommodate them. Yes, I can see that. The diocese has been discussing expanding the special ministry assignments. Would you be interested in overseeing additional parishes with similar demographic challenges? The offer every priest in my position dreams of: advancement, recognition, escape from the isolation of shepherding monsters. Vatican career advancement based on successfully managing supernatural congregations. I looked through the sacristy window at my vampires filing out of the church after evening Massachusetts Sister Caterina helping old Monsignor Celestino with his coat. 3 of the older children, teenagers technically, but transformed young enough that they still needed guidance, walking together toward the convent where the others waited for their own abbreviated service. I appreciate the confidence, Your Excellence, but I believe my current congregation still needs my particular attention. He studied me with the expression of someone trying to determine whether I was demonstrating humility or making a career mistake. The offer remains open, Father. The Vatican has great need for priests who can adapt to unusual pastoral circumstances. After he left, I sat alone in the church trying to process what I just refused. Career advancement, recognition, escape from the daily weight of shepherding souls that most of the church pretends don't exist, but also abandoning Pietro and the other children to whoever my replacement might be. Leaving my adult congregation to navigate their spiritual hunger without a shepherd who understood their needs. Walking away from the most meaningful ministry I'd ever performed because it was also the most difficult. That night, during the children's abbreviated service, Pietro approached me with a question that clarified everything. Father, are you going to leave us? What makes you ask that, Pietro? Sister Caterina said the important priest wanted to give you a different job. Are we too much trouble? I knelt beside his pew, this 8-year-old vampire who still believed in monsters under the bed despite being one himself, who said prayers before drinking the blessed blood that kept his hunger manageable, who asked theological questions that challenged every assumption I'd held about salvation and damnation. Pietro, do you remember when you lived in the tunnels? Yes, Father. Were you happy there? No. I was always hungry, and I didn't understand why. And now, he considered the question with the seriousness only children can bring to matters of ultimate importance. Now I'm still hungry sometimes, but I understand why. And I know it's not because God doesn't love me. That's right. And Pietro? I'm not going anywhere because that's what I'd learned in 21 months of shepherding vampires. That ministry isn't about advancement or recognition or career development. It's about standing witness to souls trying to find God despite circumstances that make that search complicated. My congregation, adult and child, ancient and newly transformed, struggling and transcendent, needed a shepherd who understood that holiness sometimes looked like monstrous hunger transformed into sustainable community. They needed someone who could write Vatican reports that protected their existence while helping them grow spiritually despite their supernatural nature. They needed a priest who could look at vampire children asking whether God still loved them and answer with certainty, yes, always yes, especially yes. The reports to Archbishop Camerlengo have become more creative over the months. Parish youth programs show exceptional engagement and spiritual growth. Children demonstrate unusual maturity in theological discussions and consistent attendance at religious education sessions. Community outreach efforts have expanded to include pastoral care for underserved populations in the city. Congregation members volunteer extensively with vulnerable individuals who require evening hour support services. Spiritual formation continues to emphasize the transformative power of divine grace, with particular attention to helping parishioners integrate their life experiences into a coherent understanding of God's love for all creation. All true. The Vatican receives evidence of a thriving parish with engaged members and innovative programming. They don't need to know that our youth programs involve teaching vampire children how to feed on blessed bread instead of human emotion, or that our outreach efforts involve rescuing abandoned supernatural beings from spiritual starvation. My hands no longer shake during consecration. The wine stays consistently red throughout Mass, whether I'm serving adults or children. The rules have expanded to cover situations I never imagined 18 months ago, but they've also evolved to become less about survival and more about spiritual flourishing. And every evening, when my congregation gathers for Mass, I see something that Cardinal Serafino's transcendent chalice couldn't provide. Individual souls choosing community over isolation, service over hunger, love over consumption. Even the monsters, especially when the monsters are 8 years old and still learning their bedtime prayers. Last week, Pietro asked me if he could serve as altar boy for the children's services. I want to help with God's work, Father. I've started training him in the liturgical responses, teaching him how to handle the blessed objects without harm, showing him the difference between serving the community and feeding from it. He learns quickly, this child who shouldn't exist according to most theological frameworks, who represents every complexity and contradiction of supernatural pastoral care. But when he lights the altar candles with careful reverence, when he responds to the prayers in Latin he's learning phonetically, when he looks at the crucifix with genuine devotion despite fangs that mark him as something other than human, I see the same thing I see in Sister Caterina's rosary-worn hands, in Monsignor Celestino's patient mentoring of the other children, in Madre Francesca's fierce protection of our expanded community. Saints, complicated, hungry, transformed saints who found God not despite their monstrous nature, but through learning to sanctify it. The Vatican will never recognize them as such. The Church will never canonize vampire saints or acknowledge that some paths to holiness require drinking blood that's been blessed instead of ordinary wine. But I know what I see every evening when they gather for Mass. Souls who chose love over hunger, community over isolation, service over consumption. And if that's not sainthood, I don't know what is. My report to Archbishop Camerlengo this month will read, Parish continues to thrive under current pastoral arrangements. Congregation members demonstrate sustained spiritual growth and increasing commitment to community service. Recommend continuation of current programming with minor expansions to accommodate growing membership. Growing membership. 11 vampire children rescued from spiritual starvation and counting. Because Pietro talks to the others in the tunnels, tells them about the Church where monsters are welcome, where hunger can be satisfied without harming innocence, where God's love extends even to the transformed. They're starting to come to us, Slowly, carefully, but consistently. And I'm learning that sometimes the most important ministry happens in the margins. Shepherding souls the institutional church doesn't know how to acknowledge. Writing reports that protect communities that officially don't exist. The bells ring 9 p.m., calling my congregation to evening Massachusetts adult vampires and vampire children. Ancient and newly made, struggling and transcendent. All gathering in San Benedetto to worship the God who made them, transformed them, and still calls them beloved. I light the altar candles, check the wine color one final time, perfectly red, consistently stable, and prepare to celebrate Mass for the holiest monsters I've ever known. Dominus vobiscum. I call out to souls that shouldn't exist according to most theology textbooks. Et cum spiritu tua. They respond in perfect harmony, voices blending human devotion with supernatural precision. And in that harmony, I hear something that Cardinal Serafino's transcendent chalice could never provide. The sound of individual souls choosing to worship together, despite every reason they have to remain isolated. The sound of community. The sound of love made audible. The sound of monsters becoming saints, one evening Mass at a time. God help me, I found my calling. And it sounds like children's voices singing Latin hymns in frequencies that make the church windows resonate with joy.